From the time I was 18 until the time I was 22, I spent most of that time locked up in different jailhouses around California. And I'd been sitting there with a .44 Magnum for 3 days, pulling the hammer back and trying to get up the courage to stick it up to my head to blow my brains out. And I'd hold that gun up to my head and I'd think, you know, this time I'm gonna do it. And I'd pull that hammer back and I'd...
This is The Bottom Line. I'm Gary Thiemann in Los Angeles. Alcoholism. When is it that you know you have a problem? How many do you throw down to feel normal? And are you really staring down at this barrel? Life had to be pretty hard for Bill R.
My name is Bill and I am an alcoholic. One of my earliest recollections growing up was one night Mom and Dad were sitting around having a few beers and had some of the neighbors over, and they had a few more beers, and then they had a few more beers. And the next thing I knew, somebody was going through a plate glass window. A short time later, the cops were at the house. There was blood on the hardwood floor, and my brother and I were looking at each other thinking that we were never going to be like that again. It was never going to be like that again. The next morning we both woke up and went into the room that all of this had happened at, and the window was still without glass, and there was still some blood on the floor, and Mom and Dad were in bed. And I picked up one of the glasses that they'd been drinking out of the night before, and I remember picking it up and smelling into it and looking at my brother, and I couldn't imagine anybody drinking what had been in there. It smelled that bad, and I remember looking at him and saying, "We're never going to be like that, huh?" And he said, "No, we're never going to be like that." And as it turned out, by the time I was 13 years old, I found that alcohol did wonderful things for me. It allowed me to feel courageous. I didn't feel awkward as a 13-year-old boy anymore, and it made me think that maybe John Wayne was my hero, and I could act like him more, and I could impress the girls more. And one night my dad came into me and he handed me a box full of booze, and there were several bottles of different types of booze in it, and he said, "Here, I want you to hide this from your mother." And I took that box of booze and I took it out to the barn and I hid that box of booze. And a few nights later, a friend of mine and I decided that we'd go out and see what was happening with that box of booze out in the barn, and we took a quart canteen, an army canteen. And I took a lid off of one of the bottles and poured a little bit into that canteen, and then I took a lid off another one of the bottles and poured a little bit in that canteen, and there was gin and vodka and rum and brandy, and I just kept pouring it in that canteen till it was full, and then I shook it up good and I took the lid off of it and took a big old gulp of it. And my partner Rick, he did the same thing, took a big old gulp off of it, and we went around and sat down behind the barn, and boy, a little while later a funny thing happened. I noticed that my buddy Rick, he was sitting there and he started getting sick. And I remember the feeling that I had that, boy, this is great, and I want some more. And that was my introduction basically to getting drunk with, and the feelings that come about from getting drunk, and boy, that nice warm feeling going down inside and making me think that I could conquer the world. About 4 years later was the first time I ever went to jail, and I continued drinking on weekends as going to school and partying on the weekends, and 4 years later I was sitting behind a dance in Pomona, and I ended up going to jail that night. First time, I was 17 years old. And from that point, it was a steady downhill climb, or downhill run. You know, I hear a lot of people talk about all the fun times they had when they were drinking, and I suppose I had a few. But most of what I remember today about my drinking was that I was always in trouble. I just couldn't get enough. As long as my eyes were open and I was walking around or I was consciously awake, if I started drinking, I had to keep drinking. From the time I was 18 until the time I was 22, I spent most of that time locked up in different jailhouses around California as a direct result of what I would do when I would drink. Of course, it never was my fault. It was always somebody else's fault. But I know one thing about drinking, that once I started, I could never stop. Unless I would end up in a jailhouse or end up passed out somewhere. When I got out of jail, I thought that getting married would solve my problems, and I probably wouldn't have to drink as much, so I did. I got married, and I married a gal that had 3 kids. We ended up having another one, and the marriage went on the rocks as a direct result of my drinking again. And I always was blaming anything that went on with me. I would always find fault with someone else as to why it would happen the way it happened, and I never really took a good look at the fact that it was me drinking and getting in trouble. When I was 22 years old, I decided that if I moved, I would probably have a better chance of getting my life together, and the woman I was living with, the woman I was married to, wasn't wanting to be a part of my actions anymore, and I moved up to Alaska. First place I lived in Alaska was on an island 90 miles west of Juneau. I thought I could escape the things that were going on as a result of my drinking, and I lived out in the woods. There was nobody around me for miles and miles. And a funny thing happened. Some of the local fishermen started finding out there was a guy living out in the woods, and the next thing I knew, it was one of the party spots of southeast Alaska. As my drinking progressed, I found it necessary for me to move from where I was living out in the woods and move to a town somewhere that would facilitate me to be able to have easy access to alcohol. My first wife and I divorced. So I went into town one winter and to find a woman, and I went into Juneau and found a gal that, as a result, put up with my drinking for another 15 years. It was a long, long time before I ever realized that I had to do something about what was going on. The last drunk I went on lasted 5.5 years. I ended up losing everything that was near and dear to me. My family moved away. The house I was living in was being repossessed. I was living in a little town called North Pole, Alaska. It was about 30 below zero, and I was staying in that house, and they had turned off the electricity because I couldn't pay the bill. They'd turned off my telephone. I'd run out of heating oil. And I couldn't imagine living any longer. I was living to drink, and I was drinking to live. And I'd been sitting there with a .44 Magnum for 3 days, pulling the hammer back and trying to get up the courage to stick it up to my head to blow my brains out. And I'd hold that gun up to my head and I'd think, you know, this time I'm gonna do it. And I'd pull that hammer back and I just want to do it so bad. And I'd reach over and I'd aim it at the wall and I'd shoot a hole in the wall. And then I'd end up shooting holes in the wall and in the plumbing, and I had antifreeze in the lines of our plumbing in the hot water baseboard heating system, and it ended up getting all in the carpet and ended up freezing in the carpet. And I remember crawling around on my hands and knees trying to find some of the money that I thought I'd stashed somewhere so that I could walk down to the liquor store and get another bottle of booze. I had an old down coat that that I'd leaned up against the wood stove in it so many times that I'd burned holes in it and there were feathers sticking out of it, and I used to patch those holes with duct tape, and there was duct tape coming out from around all the, or there was feathers coming out from around all the duct tape, and I put that coat on, and I found these pennies that I'd rolled up and stashed somewhere in the house, and I had to get another drink. I was waking up in the morning at that time, and I had to get down the first shot, and then I would have to vomit it up, and get down another shot and have to vomit it up, and finally the third gulp of booze that morning, I could get it to settle down, and once I could get one to settle down, I was good for the day, and then I could drink the rest of the day. I put that coat on, and I had the feathers sticking out from the duct tape, and reached in my pocket and pulled a beanie out of my pocket and put it on, and it had feathers sticking all out from around it. And I figured if I could make it the quarter mile down to the main road, that I could go ahead and hitchhike onto the liquor store, which is 6 miles down the road. It was about 30 below zero, and I was sick, and I had a cold, and my nose was running, and I had a big old mustache, and I headed on out at 30 below zero, and got the quarter mile down to the main road, and amazingly enough, nobody had picked me up. I ended up having to walk the 6 miles to the liquor store, and my nose was running all this time, and it was freezing in my mustache, and I remember standing out in front of that liquor store thinking, you know, I got to get myself looking good here, so when I walk inside and I lay these pennies down on that counter, this guy doesn't think I got a problem. And that's the way it happened.
Inspired by his own mother's sobriety, Bill R. gave Alcoholics Anonymous a shot. He had surrendered. He now became willing to work the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous one day at a time.
A couple days later, my wife came back to the house, and my family had moved away because there was nothing they could do to help me, and they knew it. But they still really loved me. My wife had been talking to my mom, who was a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous and had been for almost 16 years at that time. And she told my mom what I'd been going through and what was happening in our lives, and she came over and told me that my mom was willing to help, and there were people in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that were willing to help. And I felt so bad about myself. I just couldn't, I had no self-esteem left. I really couldn't imagine going on any longer. I felt like a failure because I hadn't been able to blow my brains out with that gun. My wife asked me to call my mom, and she was in California and I was in North Pole, Alaska, and I did. It was the first time in a long time that I'd humbled myself to ask out and reach out to somebody else for some help. And the one thing she asked me was, "Are you done? Do you really want some help?" And at that particular moment, I was done. And I really thought I did want the help. She told me that if I would make an effort, that she'd send me a plane ticket. And I don't know about anybody else, but you know, it's real hard to reach out to your parents like that and accept that kind of charity, and I felt that it was beneath me to do that, but I was so desperate that I had to do something. And I did. I accepted the plane ticket, and I flew down to LA and ended up in men's recovery home in Sylmar. And I spent 28 days there. I was introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. I was introduced to people that had long-term sobriety, that were successful in their businesses, and they were successful in their family lives, and they were successful in the things that they attempted to do. And they told me that what I was going to have to do is I was going to have to learn how to live life on life's terms, and to make the program of Alcoholics Anonymous a way of life and not a hobby. And that was something that I feel very fortunate today that I was able to grasp hold of right away. Was the positive people in the program that were telling me that there were a lot of positive things that could happen in my life if I would do certain things. The first thing I had to do, and I had to do it out there on the streets, was I had to learn that I was powerless over alcohol. And as a result, my life was unmanageable. And it truly was. I remember when I first started going to AA meetings, I wouldn't stand in the circle at the end of the meetings and say the Lord's Prayer because I didn't want to hold hands with people, and I didn't think the Lord's Prayer was that important. And so I'd always excuse myself a few minutes before the meeting ended. Today I'm glad to say I don't do that. It's become a very important part of my life. As an active member of the program Alcoholics Anonymous, I have a sponsor in the program today that works with a lot of people, new people when they come in. And that's why I've chosen him as a sponsor, because I see the importance of that today, to reach out and to give so freely back what was given to me. Nobody asked me for any money. Nobody asked me for anything. They didn't tell me I had to be a certain way or do a certain thing, other than to want to stay sober, to have a desire to stop drinking, and then, at that point, be willing to work the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I think what amazes me most is the fact that those people that are students of that big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, the book entitled Alcoholics Anonymous, those people seem to live happy lives without drinking, without using any kind of mind-altering chemicals. And that's what I wanted for so long. I always wanted everybody to believe that my heroes were John Wayne and Superman and all the tough guys in the world, when in reality my heroes was always Ward Cleaver and Father Knows Best and people like that, I had the opportunity last Saturday night of giving my mom a 20-year cake in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And for those of you who've never been to an AA meeting, that means a lot to people like us. And my wife had asked me years ago when I was drinking a lot, do you think maybe you could sober up if your mom did? And I could never imagine her doing it. So God works in mysterious ways. Puts people in our lives that help us to understand what we can accomplish. People to be good examples. I certainly hope you find what I've found through the fellowship and the program, and encourage anybody out there to get one of the books of Alcoholics Anonymous and to read it. And if you find a piece of yourself in that book, you've got a chance to live a life of sobriety and to have some of those promises fulfilled of being happy, joyous, and free. God bless you.
We open our hearts to be filled by you, till we're overflowing with your love. Our only desire is to be more like you, so when others see us, they'll see you. I'll recommit my life, 'cause you paid the price. Know everything you gave me, I'll give back to you. Oh, and this time, made up my mind to serve you. I'll give my life to you. This from the pain of sin. The only way to be totally free, for nothing will reign in me. I'll give to you my life, a living sacrifice to do your will, no matter the price. Oh, at this time, I made up my mind to serve you, Lord. I'll give my life to you. This time, I made up my mind to serve you. I'll recommit my life back to you. We will serve you. We will serve you. We'll serve you, Lord, only you. This time I made up my mind. I'm serve you. We will serve you. Now I can do what you want from me. Made up my mind. I really wanna serve you. This time, made up my mind, Lord. Oh Lord, I'll recommit my life back to you.
You've been listening to The Bottom Line featuring Bill R. Our thanks to the Jackson family for their musical contribution this time. And also, Bill, thanks so much for caring enough to share your experience, strength, and hope. This show is produced for Armed Forces Radio, heard worldwide. I'm Gary Thiemann. Until next time, God bless you. And share the message, won't you? This has been a GRT production.
Mm-hmm.